The mist that clung to the hills of Britannia in that final decade felt different. It was no longer just a familiar damp of the Atlantic coast. It was a chill of isolation, a creeping fog of forgotten orders and silent roads. For nearly 4 centuries, the rhythm of life here had been dictated by Rome, the tramp of legionary sandals on stone-paved streets, the bellow of centurions, the distant clatter from the potteries and forges that fed the empire's insatiable appetite. The land was crisscrossed with the proud scars of civilization, straight roads cutting through ancient forests, sturdy stone bridges over rushing streams, and towns like Londinium and Eboracum, where the forums echoed with a dozen languages and the baths steamed with the vapors of a continent-spanning identity. But by the turn of the 5th century, that rhythm was faltering. The beat was slowing, missing, becoming erratic. The great machine was running down, and every soul, from the governor in his palace to the farmer tending his strip of land near the wall, could feel it in their bones, a subliminal dread, the world holding its breath. This was not a sudden cataclysm, not a single fire from the sky. It was a slow, inexorable bleeding out. The administrative heart of the diocese, once a powerhouse of imperial logistics, was beating with a weak, anemic pulse. Tax revenues, the lifeblood of the Roman state, were no longer flowing reliably across the Channel to Gaul. The bronze and silver coins, once so plentiful, were becoming scarce, their replacements mere bronze-washed slugs, pathetic imitations of a dying majesty. In the towns, the grand public works, the basilicas, the aqueducts, the amphitheaters began to show patches of neglect. A cracked paving stone went unreplaced. A leak in the aqueduct was patched with wood instead of lead. These were small things, insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of decay, like the first wrinkles on the face of a dying man. The very idea of Romanitas, of being Roman, was becoming abstract, a memory of a more prosperous time rather than a living, breathing reality. Nowhere was this decay more palpable than along Hadrian's Wall. That magnificent 73-mile slash of stone and discipline that severed the island in two. For generations, it had been more than a fortification. It was a statement. It was the absolute physical limit of the civilized world. To the south, law, order, vineyards, and Latin grammar. To the north, the terrifying, beautiful chaos of the painted people, the Picts. But the garrisons manning the mile castles and forts were shadows of their former selves. The legionaries, once the empire's finest, were now mostly local recruits, their loyalty to their homeland outweighing their fealty to a distant emperor they would never see. Their pay was late, or did not come at all. Their uniforms grew shabby. The daily drills lost their razor-sharp precision. They looked out from the ramparts not as conquerors, but as anxious sentinels, watching the gathering dark beyond the wall, knowing the delicate balance of fear that had kept the peace was beginning to tilt. In the villas that dotted the southern countryside, the landed gentry, the backbone of Roman provincial society, felt the change in a more subtle but equally terrifying way. Their wealth, derived from vast estates producing grain and wool for the continental markets, was evaporating as trade routes grew dangerous and then collapsed entirely. The mosaic floors in their triclinia still depicted vibrant scenes of gods and goddesses, but the rooms above were growing cold. The hypocaust systems, which once pumped warm air through the walls, were falling into disrepair, too costly and complex to maintain. They continued to host dinners, serving wine from dwindling stocks, speaking the cultured Latin of Cicero, but their conversations were hushed, anxious. They spoke of news from Gaul, of barbarian hordes, of usurpers, their eyes constantly flickering towards the northern windows, as if expecting to see not the familiar order of their gardens, but the glow of a strange fire on the horizon. And then there were the people. The common citizens of Britannia, the Celtic natives, the retired soldiers, the merchants, the craftsmen. Their world was contracting. The safety that had allowed a man to travel from Diva to Duravernum with a purse of coins and no weapon was gone. The legal system that had resolved disputes in a court of law was becoming inaccessible, replaced by the older, more immediate justice of local strongmen and kinship ties. The Christian faith, which had recently been spreading through the cities, now offered a promise of a heavenly kingdom, while the earthly one crumbled around them. In the churches, the prayers took on a new, desperate tone, not for prosperity, but for simple deliverance. The very fabric of daily life was unraveling, thread by painful thread. This was the atmosphere of the year 406, a pressure cooker of anxiety and isolation. Britannia was a province adrift, a great ship still boasting the eagle standard on its sail, but with its rudder shattered and its crew muttering in the hold. It was a society waiting for a catalyst, for a single event that would transform this slow decline into a final, irrevocable collapse. That catalyst would not come from the north, from the Picts, but from within the ranks of the very army that was meant to be its protector. The desperation of the island was about to birth a desperate solution, one that would, in a single stroke, drain it of its last remaining strength and leave it naked before the coming storm. The stage was set not for a battle, but for an abandonment. The actors were in place. The anxious populace, the neglected military, the isolated aristocracy. All that was needed was a man with enough ambition or enough folly to raise a standard and set in motion the final act. The fog was thickening, and from within it, a figure began to emerge. A soldier, a dreamer, a usurper. He would promise salvation, but deliver only exile. He would offer the empire, and in return, he would take everything that was left. Next, Section 2. The Usurper's Gambit, Constantine III, and the Legion's Exodus. The spark that lit the pyre was not a barbarian torch, but the glint of ambition in a soldier's eye. His name is lost to legend, known only as Constantine, a common military commander, one of many in a land teeming with restless, underpaid garrisons. In the year 407, the tension in Britannia snapped. The news from the continent was a cascade of disasters. The Rhine frontier, that mighty river barrier, had been shattered the previous winter by a confederation of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, who now ran rampant through the heart of Roman Gaul. The legitimate emperor in the west, the feeble Honorius, was holed up in Ravenna, seemingly impotent. For the soldiers in Britain, watching their world dissolve from the edge of the map, the message was clear. Rome had failed. Salvation, if it was to come at all, would not arrive from Italy. It would have to be forged from their own will, their own steel. And so, in a scene of chaotic, desperate acclamation, the army did what Roman armies had done for centuries when pushed to the brink. They raised their own man, their own emperor, on their shields. This was no mere mutiny. It was a calculated, if reckless, gamble for survival. Constantine, now styling himself Flavius Claudius Constantinus, did not see himself as a rebel. In his mind, and in the narrative he would have desperately spun, he was the last true Roman, a restorer of order, the only man with the strength to do what the legitimate emperor could not: sweep the barbarians from Gaul and restore the integrity of the empire. His first act was one of breathtaking audacity and profound consequence. He began to strip the island of its military strength. The forts along Hadrian's Wall were emptied, their garrisons ordered south to join the new imperial standard. The coastal defenses of the Saxon shore, the fleet, the infantry, the cavalry, every last professional soldier, every scrap of functional military hardware was gathered for the great crossing. It was a mass exodus. The very bones of the Roman military presence were being pulled from the soil of Britannia, leaving behind a skeletal, ghostly framework. Imagine the scene on the southern coasts, not the orderly embarkation of a legion on campaign, but the chaotic, hopeful, and terrifying mobilization of an entire military society. The docks were a cacophony of shouted orders, the lowing of supply oxen, and the clatter of arms. Ships, some freshly caulked, others looking dangerously sea-worn, were loaded to the gunwales with men, their armor polished for a new emperor, not for the defense of their homes. They left behind their British-born wives, their children, the towns they had grown up in. They were marching to save an idea of Rome, and in doing so, they were physically abandoning the physical Rome they had been sworn to protect. As the last sails dipped below the horizon, a silence must have fallen upon the shores of Britannia, a silence more frightening than any barbarian war cry. The eagle had flown, and it was not coming back. Constantine's campaign in Gaul was initially, and deceptively, successful. He crossed the Channel, established a base at Arles, and for a brief, flickering moment, It seemed his gamble might pay off. He rallied Roman forces in Gaul and Hispania, and even managed to secure a shaky, temporary recognition from the terrified Honorius. But the usurper's throne was built on sand. His authority was constantly challenged by rival generals and barbarian warlords playing their own complex games. His focus was entirely consumed by the continental struggle, by the politics of a court he had created in exile. Britannia, the source of his power, faded from his view. It was a province he had used as a stepping stone, its resources spent, its purpose in his grand design now fulfilled. He sent no governors back, no fresh legions, not even a message of reassurance. The island was a spent cartridge, ejected from the mechanism of his ambition. Back in Britannia, the reality of their new existence began to dawn with the slow, cruel clarity of a winter sunrise. The townsfolk of Eberacum or Lindum, who had watched the last column of soldiers march away, now looked to the empty northern road with a hollow dread. The local nobles, the curiales, who were legally bound to administer the towns and collect taxes, found themselves in an impossible position. There was no central authority to report to, no army to deliver the taxes to, and a rapidly diminishing population from whom to collect them. The sophisticated bureaucracy that had governed their lives for centuries simply ceased to function. The writing tablets in the magistrates' offices remained blank. The tax rolls gathered dust. The machinery of the state had not been overthrown. It had been unplugged, and no one knew how to start it again. In this power vacuum, the old ways began to reassert themselves with a primal urgency. The Roman system of centralized governance gave way to localism. The city, the civitas, was no longer the primary unit of identity and safety. It was the local region, the tribe, the kin group. Men of influence, wealthy landowners with large estates, former military officers with knowledge of arms began to organize their own defenses. They raised militias from their tenants and dependents, fortifying their villas, not with the thought of serving a distant empire, but of protecting their own. This was the birth of the war band, the comitatus, the foundation of the petty kingships that would soon dot the land. The polished Latin of the Forum was gradually drowned out by the older guttural tones of Brythonic, the language of the pre-Roman tribe. The cultural reversion had begun. The final bitter irony for Britannia was the fate of its usurper savior. Constantine III's adventure ended not in glory, but in betrayal and execution. His own general, a man named Gerontius, rebelled against him in Hispania, while Honorius's forces, under the capable general Constantius, besieged him in Arles. By 411, it was over. Constantine was captured and beheaded, his head paraded on a pole to Ravenna. The last great military force to call Britannia home had been utterly destroyed, not in the defense of the island, but in a futile quest for a continental crown. The soldiers who had left their homes to follow him were dead, scattered, or absorbed into other armies. They were ghosts in Gaul, and they had left ghosts in Britain. The gambit had failed, and the price was a province stripped bare, utterly alone. Its fate now resting not in the hands of emperors, but in the whims of the tides and the gathering shadows beyond its undefended shores. Next, Section 3. The breach in the wall. Picts, Scots, and Saxons at the gates. The silence that followed the legion's exodus was not a true silence, but the tense, humming quiet of a world holding its breath. It was the space between the lightning strike and the thunderclap. And the thunder, when it came, did not arrive from a single direction, but from all points of the compass at once. A converging storm of long-suppressed hunger and ancient grudges. The first to sense the vulnerability, to smell the weakness on the wind, were the Picts from the north. For generations, they had been contained by the sheer psychological and military mass of Hadrian's Wall, not just the stone and the soldiers, but the terrifying, unshakable idea of Rome. Now, that idea was gone. Scouting parties would have crept forward, touching the cold, unmortared stones, finding the gates unguarded, the watchtowers empty. The news would have spread through the glens and highlands like wildfire. The Great Barrier was dead. It was no longer a wall, but a line of crumbling stones to be stepped over. From the west, across the Irish Sea, came a different kind of menace. The Scotti, seafaring raiders from the land of Hibernia, had long been a nuisance, striking the coasts in swift, terrifying attacks. But a nuisance is something one can manage with a fleet and coastal forts. Now, with the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet, disbanded or drawn away to continental wars, the sea was no longer a Roman lake. It was a highway for invaders. Their small, hide-covered curraghs, once spotted with dread from signal towers, now landed on deserted beaches with impunity. What began as raids for slaves and plunder soon evolved into something far more permanent. They began to stay, carving out small settlements on the western coasts, in regions that would one day bear their name, Dalriata in the far north, and later, the whole land would be called Scotland after them. They were not just raiders anymore. They were settlers, and their arrival signaled a fundamental demographic shift. But the most profound and enduring threat gathered in the east, from across the grey, churning waters of the North Sea. The Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, a confederation of Germanic sea peoples whom the Romans had lumped together as a single, faceless terror. For decades, the mighty system of forts known as the Saxon Shore had held them at bay, a chain of stone and mortar sentinels from Branadunum to Portus Aderni. Now, those forts were garrisons of ghosts. The signal fires were cold, the watchmen were gone. The Saxon longships, with their high carved prows and square sails, no longer had to risk landings on defended beaches. They could sail up the great rivers, the Tamises and the Temesa, probing deep into the heart of the province, finding rich, undefended villas and thriving towns whose only walls were the memories of their citizens. The raids intensified from seasonal piracy to a relentless, probing invasion. The experience for the native Britons was one of unending, spiraling terror. A farmer tilling his field near the old wall would be the first to see the smoke from a neighboring villa, a black stain against the sky. The news would arrive in fragments, carried by breathless refugees stumbling down the military roads. Picks. They're through. They took everything, burned it all. In a town like Viraconium, the panic would be a physical thing, a contagion in the air. The once orderly streets would become a chaos of frantic packing, of families trying to decide what to save, where to flee. There were no soldiers to call, no governor to send aid. The only defense was a hastily assembled mob of townsfolk and farmers, armed with hunting spears, pruning hooks, and the occasional precious heirloom sword, a pathetic force against the hardened, battle-joyous warbands descending upon them. The violence was not the disciplined clash of legions. It was intimate, brutal, and total. Archaeology paints a stark, silent picture of this collapse. In the layers of soil corresponding to these years, the beautiful red Samian ware pottery from Gaul disappears, replaced by crude, locally made copies. In the villas, coin hoards are buried in frantic haste by owners who never return to reclaim their wealth, a silver denarius nestled next to a worthless bronze nummus, all treasure rendered equal by desperation. At sites like Vindolanda, just south of the wall, the evidence is even more visceral. The final layers show not a planned abandonment, but a violent end. Buildings burned, objects scattered in flight, the bones of the slain left unburied. The thin veneer of Roman civilization was being scoured away, revealing the raw Iron Age reality that had always lain beneath. In response, a desperate local form of leadership began to crystallize. The title of these men is lost, but their function is clear. They were the defenders, the war leaders, the ones who could organize a resistance. They were likely a mix of the remaining Romano-British aristocracy, former junior army officers, and local chieftains whose power had been suppressed by Rome but never fully extinguished. They would have fortified the old hill forts their ancestors had abandoned centuries before, the ditches and ramparts on the high places seeing use once more. They would have tried to coordinate, to send messages to one another, to form a patchwork defense. But it was a fight against the tide. For every raiding party they drove off, 2 more would land elsewhere. The province was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and the only thing the emerging warlords could do was try to staunch the flow, to save their own small piece of a shattered world. This was the Crucible. The year 410 was not a single event, but a state of being, a relentless, grinding pressure that shattered old loyalties and forged new ones in blood and fire. The comfortable, urban life of the Roman town was becoming a death trap. The future belonged to those who could fight, who could command loyalty, and who could offer protection in a world where the only law was the sword. The civilized province of Britannia was dying, and from its corpse, something older, tougher, and infinitely more volatile was struggling to be born. The age of the Legion was over. The age of the Warlord, the Dux Bellorum, had begun. This response is AI generated, for reference only. Next, section 4. The Plea and the Silence. A letter to a vanished emperor. In the crumbling council chamber of a city like Londinium or Corinium, a group of men, the last vestiges of organized Roman authority in Britannia, gathered by the light of a guttering oil lamp. They were the Curiales, the city fathers, men whose families had governed for generations under the comforting weight of imperial law. Now, that weight was gone, and they felt terrifyingly light, adrift in a sea of chaos. Their togas were worn thin, their faces etched with a fatigue that was more than physical. It was the exhaustion of a system, of a world view reaching its end. Before them lay a blank sheet of parchment, and the task at hand was one of unimaginable pathos: to write a letter, not to a provincial governor or a military commander, for there were none, but to the very source of all power, to the emperor himself, Flavius Honorius Augustus, in his distant, impregnable court at Ravenna. This was the agitatorium, the groans of the Britons, a final desperate scream into the gathering dark. The language of this letter, now lost to time, would have been a masterpiece of formal rhetoric and raw, undignified panic. It would have begun with the proper honorifics, the elaborate flourishes owed to the Dominus Noster, our Lord, but the civility would have quickly frayed, giving way to a torrent of vivid, horrifying detail. They would have described the Picts swarming over the corpse of the wall, the barbarians driving us to the sea, a phrase that would echo down the centuries. They would have written of the Saxons, the sea driving us back to the barbarians, a perfect, terrible summary of their trap. They would have listed the towns put to the torch, the villas looted, the fields left fallow for fear of the reaper who was not a man but a sword. It was a plea not for luxury, not for tax relief, but for the most basic function of a state: protection. Send us legions, they begged. Return to us our own soldiers. Remember that we are Romans too. The journey of this letter was an epic in miniature, a testament to a dying world's last gasp of connectivity. The scroll was entrusted to a messenger, a man of unimaginable courage or desperation, perhaps a retired soldier who still remembered the old roads. He would have taken ship from a southern port, a dangerous crossing through seas now patrolled by Saxon pirates. Landing in Gaul, he would have found not a peaceful Roman province, but a landscape as shattered as his own. The roads were cut by warring bands of Goths, Burgundians, and rival Roman generals. Every mile was a gamble, every stranger a potential killer. The journey to Ravenna, which once might have taken a few weeks with imperial post horses, would have stretched into months of perilous, clandestine travel. The message itself became a relic, a fragile piece of parchment carrying the fate of a province through a continent in convulsion. When, or if, the messenger finally reached Ravenna, he would have been met by a reality utterly disconnected from the one he had left. Ravenna was a world unto itself, a city of marshes and magnificent palaces, insulated by its lagoons, and by an imperial court drowning in its own intricate rituals and conspiracies. Here, the crisis in Britannia would not have been seen as the collapse of a part of the empire's body, but as a piece of inconvenient news from a distant, fog-bound frontier. The court of Honorius was less concerned with barbarians at the edge of the world than with the Goth Alaric, who was, at that very moment, knocking at the gates of Italy itself. The plea from Britannia was just one more problem on a pile of catastrophes, and the emperor, a weak man surrounded by stronger, competing advisors, had no resources, no will, and no attention to spare. So, the Britons waited. The seasons turned. In the towns, they would have posted lookouts, not just for Pictish raiders, but for a sail from the continent, for the glint of a legionary eagle on the horizon. They repaired what breaches they could in their own walls. They sent what little wealth they had to hire Frankish or Saxon mercenaries, playing one barbarian against another in a deadly, short-sighted game. But with each passing month, hope curdled into a sour realization. The silence from Ravenna was not a pause. It was an answer. It was the sound of the empire turning its back. The very act of sending the plea had been an act of faith in the system, and the system's non-response was a more profound collapse than any barbarian assault. It was the death of an idea. The contract between Rome and its citizens had been broken. The psychological impact of this silence cannot be overstated. For centuries, the people of Britannia had defined themselves in relation to Rome. They were Romano-Britons. Now, that identity was rendered meaningless. If Rome would not answer, then they were not Romans. They were simply Britons, alone on their island fortress. This forced a profound, traumatic shift in consciousness. The old ways of doing things, appealing to a higher authority, relying on a centralized military, defining law by imperial edict, were now obsolete. The city fathers who had sent the letter found their authority withering away. Who needed administrators when there was nothing left to administer? The future belonged to the men with the swords, the tyranny or war leaders, who offered not the abstract promise of Roman justice, but the immediate brutal reality of protection in exchange for loyalty. The plea was the last formal act of Roman Britannia. It was the moment the patient, after a long and wasting illness, ally accepted that the doctor was not coming. The silence that followed was the diagnosis. Terminal. It forced upon the people a terrible, liberating truth. No one was coming to save them. There would be no last-minute rescue, no divine intervention from the eternal city. They were on their own. The only laws that mattered were the laws of survival. The only gods who listened were the gods of the hearth and the battlefield. The groans of the Britons faded, unanswered, into the wind. And in that silence, a new, harder people began to find their voice. They had asked for an emperor, and in his place, they would have to learn to make kings. Next, Section 5. The Unthinkable Act, Alaric's Sack and the Shattering of Faith. While the Britons scanned the empty horizon for a sign from Ravenna, a seismic shock was rippling through the very foundations of the world, an event so psychologically cataclysmic that it made their provincial plight seem insignificant. For 800 years, the city of Rome had stood inviolate. Its walls had not been breached by a foreign enemy since the Gauls in a misty, almost mythical past. Rome was not merely a city. It was the caput mundi, the head of the world, the eternal, the undying heart of civilization, law, and divine favor. Its security was a fundamental article of faith for every person who called themselves Roman. From a senator in his villa to a farmer in a distant province like Britannia. And then, in the year 410, the unthinkable happened. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, a people the Romans considered barbarians, marched through the open Salarian gate, and for 3 days, his army sacked the eternal city. The news did not travel to Britannia as a swift, clean report. It would have arrived in fragments, carried by terrified merchants, shipwrecked refugees, or Gallic traders whose faces were ashen with a kind of religious horror. The stories they told would have been unbelievable, apocalyptic. They spoke of Gothic soldiers looting the ancient temples, of fires scarring the forum, of the sacred Vestal virgins violated, and of the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia, taken as a prize. The psychological impact was immeasurable. If Rome could fall, then what was safe? The entire cosmic order. The Pax Deorum that guaranteed the empire's existence seemed to have been shattered. The city that was the anchor of all reality had been torn from its moorings, and every soul in the empire felt themselves spiritually adrift. For the Christian communities in Britannia's dying cities, the event was a theological earthquake. The intellectual leaders of the time, like St. Jerome in his monastery in Bethlehem, wrote that the bright light of all the world was put out. The whole world perished in one city. How could God have allowed this to happen? Had he abandoned his people? The pagans among the Britons, who had never fully relinquished their old gods, saw it as divine retribution for abandoning the ancient rites that had made Rome great. The Christians struggled to reconcile the disaster with their faith, a struggle that would eventually lead Augustine of Hippo to write The City of God, arguing that the true empire was not of this world. But for the common person, huddled in a cold British church, such philosophical nuances were little comfort. The event felt like a judgment, a final withdrawal of celestial favor that mirrored the earthly withdrawal of the legions. This cosmic crisis rendered the Britons' own desperate plea to Honorius not just unanswered, but absurdly irrelevant. Their letter, asking for legions to fight Pictish raiders, was now a message sent to a ghost. The emperor, who was supposed to be their protector, had proven incapable of protecting his own capital, the very navel of the world. The authority of the imperial office, already weakened, evaporated completely in the wake of this news. Honorius was not a distant, powerful god-king. He was a failed ruler hiding in a swamp-girt palace while the heart of his empire was carved out. To swear allegiance to such a man was not just futile, it was madness. The last shred of ideological connection to the central government was severed, not by a formal decree, but by the crushing weight of this symbolic collapse. In this vacuum of both temporal and spiritual power, the people of Britannia were forced to turn inward. They could no longer look to Rome for salvation, because Rome itself was a victim. The concept of Roma Aeterna was a lie. The great stone anchor of their civilization had proven to be made of sand. This realization accelerated the localization of power and identity that was already underway. If the empire could not save itself, it certainly could not save them. Their world now shrank to the boundaries of what they could see and defend. Their own valley, their own fortified hilltop, their own warlord's hall. The broader Roman identity, which had once connected a soldier on the wall to a bureaucrat in Alexandria, was replaced by a parochial, desperate localism. They were not Romans of Britannia. They were the people of Gwynedd, or of Dumnonia, or of the Pennines. The sack of Rome did not just change the political landscape, it altered the very flow of time and memory. For centuries, history had been the story of Rome's expansion and consolidation. Now, it had become a story of retreat and disintegration. The past was no longer a golden age to be emulated, but a lost world to be mourned. The future was no longer a promise of continued order, but a frightening question mark. In the villas and towns of Britain, the last generations to have known true Roman peace now became the guardians of a lost golden age, telling stories to their children of a time when roads were safe, when coins were plentiful, and when the name of Rome was a shield against the dark. The year 410 became a rift in time. On one side lay the remembered world of law and light, on the other, the uncertain struggle of the present. The fall of a city 1,000 miles away had, in one terrible stroke, confirmed their deepest fears and liberated them from their last illusion. They were truly, utterly, and forever on their own. Give sections 6 and 7 of this documentary. The decades that followed the sack of Rome were not recorded in the clear lines of history, but in the smudges between. To later generations, they would appear as a blank space on the map, a silence between the end of Roman Britannia and the beginning of something new. Historians call it the sub-Roman period. The people who lived through it had no such word. To them, it was simply after the eagles, after the governors, after the world they had known. The infrastructure of empire, that intricate web of trade, administration, and law, had disintegrated. Roads crumbled under weeds, milestones fell, and the towns, those proud symbols of Roman urbanity, began to hollow out. Londinium, once a bustling hub of commerce and governance, became a ghost city, its wharves rotting, its streets echoing only with the footsteps of scavengers. The mosaic floors of villas cracked beneath the frost, the once gilded baths filled with rainwater and silence. Civilization did not vanish in a single night. It eroded, inch by inch, as the skills that sustained it faded into memory. Yet amid the ruins, life went on. Fields were still plowed, hearths still burned, children still laughed. In the countryside, local strongmen, part warriors, part landlords, part patriarchs, emerged as the new centers of authority. They ruled not by Roman law, but by oath and blood. Their courts were held not in basilicas, but in timber halls. Their justice was swift, personal, and often brutal. It was a return, in form if not in spirit, to an older way of life, tribal, kin-based, intensely local. Christianity survived, though transformed. The great urban bishoprics dwindled, their cathedrals abandoned, but in the countryside, small wooden churches clung to life. Monks and hermits retreated into the wild places, the mountains of Wales, the western cliffs of Cornwall, the misty isles of the Irish Sea, keeping alive not just the faith, but literacy itself. By flickering candlelight, they copied the last precious manuscripts of Rome, not as administrators of an empire, but as guardians of memory. These humble, isolated outposts would one day become the seeds of the Celtic Church, preserving learning while the rest of Europe forgot how to read its own past. Archaeology reveals a strange duality in these years. The pottery is crude, the buildings simple, but the graves are rich, filled with ornate brooches, swords, and imported goods from across the sea. Power was shifting, but it had not disappeared. Trade persisted, rerouted through new channels. Ireland, Armorica, the far coasts of the Mediterranean. Britannia was no longer the northern province of a mighty empire. It was an island trading in memories and myth, surviving in the twilight between history and legend. And in this twilight, stories began to grow. The old tales of warriors and kings, of defenders who rose against the tide of chaos. Names began to circulate: Ambrosius, Vortigern, Hengist, Horsa. Figures half remembered, half invented, born from the need to make sense of the ruins. They were not yet myths, but they were no longer history. The island, cut off and wounded, was beginning to dream itself anew. Out of the mists of this broken age emerged a single name, a name that would outlast empires, a name that would bind together history and hope. Arthur. We do not know if he lived, or when, or even if he was one man or many. The chronicles that first mention him were written centuries later, in a world already looking back through the haze of legend. But the persistence of his story tells us something profound: that the people of this island, battered by invasion and abandonment, needed a figure to believe in. A Dux Bellorum, a war leader who could gather the scattered fragments of a fallen province and hold back the dark, if only for a moment. The world that birthed Arthur was one of ruin and resilience. Saxon warbands were carving new kingdoms along the eastern plains: Kent, Sussex, Wessex, while the native Britons retreated into the western hills and valleys, forming the embryonic realms of Gwynedd, Powys, and Dumnonia. It was an age of constant motion, of battle and migration, of languages colliding and cultures transforming. The landscape itself became a character in this drama. The great fortresses on hilltops, the marshes and forests that swallowed armies, the ancient standing stones that seemed to whisper of a time before Rome. If Arthur was real, he was no shining knight in mail, but a hard, pragmatic warlord forged in the chaos of survival. His sword was not a symbol, but a necessity. His Camelot, if it existed at all, was likely a fortified hill, not a marble palace. Yet through the centuries, as the world stabilized, as monks set ink to parchment, his story was reshaped, polished, and sanctified. The grim warlord became a chivalric king. The battlefield became a round table. The desperate defense of a dying culture became a parable of unity, justice, and eternal return. In that transformation lies the ultimate legacy of Rome's fall in Britain. Out of despair, the island forged myth. Out of the ruins of empire, it created a legend that would outlive the empire itself. For in Arthur's story, the betrayal, the lost sword, the hope of return, we can hear the echoes of those final Roman Britons, still calling across the centuries. Their world had ended, but their longing for order, for light against the darkness, endured. The eagle was gone. The legions were dust. But in the songs and stories of a people who refused to forget, something of Rome survived, not its power, but its dream. The dream of civilization, of unity, of a king who would come again when the island was in need. And so the mists of Britannia closed once more, not in silence, but in legend. By the middle of the 5th century, the long night that had fallen over Britannia began, slowly, to give shape to a new dawn. The world the Romans had built was gone, its roads cracked, its towns hollow, its language fading from the mouths of the living, but something enduring had taken root in its place. Out of the ruins, the island was reinventing itself. It was no longer Roman, nor wholly barbarian, but something in between. A land in the process of remembering how to be itself. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, once feared raiders from across the North Sea, were becoming settlers. What had begun as coastal footholds hardened into kingdoms. Kent in the southeast, Sussex and Wessex along the southern shores, East Anglia and Northumbria rising in the east and north. The landscape itself changed under their hands. Timber halls replaced stone villas. Burial mounds rose where Roman cemeteries had lain flat, and the old Latin names of towns were swallowed and reshaped by new tongue. Londinium became Londonwich, Eboracum became Eophoric York, and the island's very sound changed. To the west, in the mountains and moors, the descendants of the Romano-Britons clung to their identity with fierce determination. In the highlands of Wales, the valleys of Cornwall, the coasts of Cumbria, and across the sea in Armorica, now Brittany, the old Celtic world persisted. They called themselves Cymri, the companions, a word born of survival, meaning we who remain. Their kings traced their bloodlines to the heroes of old Ambrosius. Arthur and their poets sang not of empire, but of endurance. The borderlands between these worlds, between Saxon and Briton, pagan and Christian, past and future, were violent, fertile, and alive. Here, the fusion that would define medieval Britain was taking place. The clash of cultures gave rise to new languages, new faiths, new ways of imagining power. Out of war came the first fragile outlines of order, the seeds of what would become England, Wales, and Scotland. The island that Rome had once ruled as a distant province was, at last, becoming a collection of nations in its own right. Yet, even as the old gave way to the new, the ghost of Rome lingered. The Saxon kings, though they worshipped different gods, adopted the trappings of imperial authority, coins bearing their faces, seals, Latin inscriptions. When they finally converted to Christianity in the generations to come, it was through missionaries who brought with them not just faith, but fragments of the Roman world, the Latin tongue, the written word, the memory of law and empire. The past had not died. It had been woven into the fabric of the new world, invisible but indelible. By the 6th century, a traveler walking the island might have seen all the layers of its history in a single glance. The tumbled ruins of a Roman forum overgrown with ivy, a Saxon hall standing proud on the hill above it, and beyond, the distant shimmer of a monastery where a monk was copying a gospel in letters descended from the scripts of Rome. The empire had fallen, but its echoes still whispered in the stones, in the faith, in the dreams of those who follow. Britannia had entered its dark age, but darkness is not the same as absence. It is the interval in which the stars begin to show. In the silence left by Rome's retreat, the island found its own voice, a rough, resilient music that would, in time, give rise to the epics of Beowulf and the elegies of the Welsh bards, to the laws of Alfred and the learning of Bede. The light that had once radiated from the marble heart of the empire now flickered in distant corners, in wooden halls, in scriptoria, in the memories of those who still dared to remember. The story of Roman Britain ends not with the clash of armies or the fall of walls, but with the quiet persistence of life itself. Out of loss came transformation, out of abandonment, renewal. The legions never returned, but in their absence, the island learned to stand on its own. The mist that once symbolized the empire's retreat now became its shroud, and in time, its womb. From Rome's ashes rose the first smoke of new fires, the hearths of kings, the candles of monks, the campfires of storytellers. And from those flames, a new world would be born.